So, hello everyone. I'm Ikram. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint, so this could be my face. But I chose the first option for the final, which is an empathy interview. And I chose to interview my dad since his immigration story always amazes me. And I feel like this class led me to have a new pair of eyes and lens when just listening and looking at the story. So, a little historical context. My family and I are ethnically Somali, which is in East Africa. However, the area in which my ancestors and some of my extended families currently live in is Ethiopia. So basically, throughout the late 1800s, there was a lot of conflict in East Africa that included Somalia, Ethiopia, England, France, and Italy, which resulted in a treaty that gave part of Somalia to Ethiopia with the promise that Somalis in that area will have their own autonomy. But Ethiopia claimed sovereignty of the area and it decided to include it within their territory. So both my parents were born and raised in Diriyadawa, Ethiopia, which had a huge population of Somalis, obviously. And at this time, in the 1960s, Somalia started to become more aggressive to hopefully gain back those territories and liberate the Somalis in the area. In response, Ethiopia started targeting the internal civilians revolting against the country. And in 1977, the Ethiopian government called for mass execution of Somalis in Ethiopia. And my dad was telling me how he would just see very graphic things on his day to day life, just dead bodies in the middle of the road, laws that would prevent Somalis from wearing traditional clothing or else they would be targeted and killed. You couldn't show any kind of emotion or even stare at the bodies too long, or else the soldiers that are casually roaming in tanks will just shoot you instantly. And my dad told me about one of his neighbors who was his age, who was actually kidnapped by one of the soldiers, and no one ever knew whatever happened to them. And it was at that time that my dad left. And long story short, he has very like it's like a movie almost listening to his immigration story, just because when he was telling me about it, he had to run by foot from Ethiopia to Somalia to end up in Djibouti at the age of 18. And he had to run at night, or else he would have been seen by the military planes and helicopters that were going over. And Djibouti at the time gave a lot of Somali refugees asylum and the ability to reside in the country with safety. And from there, he applied through the UN to attend university in Cairo, Egypt. And my dad initially met my mom in Egypt at that time, and they got married and then applied again through the UN to go to America. My dad's experience to America, I think, was very similar to like the stereotypical foreign immigrants, in that it was like new territory. He unfortunately did not know any English, but my mom thankfully was very fluent in it. And on their first day when they arrived, I think they arrived obviously in New York, but they were assigned to live in Missouri for a bit. And in their first day that they lived there, their house almost got broken into and was very targeted. So they feared for their life. Unfortunately, I shouldn't laugh. It's just like hearing the story is always amazing because it just doesn't seem real. And then the next day, they got tricked into spending more money for their taxi ride since their driver purposely drove around the area and their surroundings multiple times, assuming my parents weren't aware of what was happening, and took advantage of their oblivious nature and just telling them that they're new to the country and they didn't know much about it. After a few months of living in Missouri, they felt unsafe, so they left to Las Vegas and attended UNLV. And at UNLV, my dad took his first ESL course and had a white woman as his teacher. And one of his assignments, she wrote a comment calling him Mr. Black. So then he had to go to the dean and talk to him about it. And the professor got fired the next day, thankfully. And then fast forward a few years, he told me more things that happened to him. Monumental thing that happened to him was, of course, like 9/11 that happened. My dad had his number listed in the white pages. So he received a lot of calls from people calling him slurs, saying that it's his fault and that he should leave the country. And something along with that that brought attention to my dad in general is that he's not necessarily like an emotional person. Like he doesn't show his emotion a lot. But I think the one time that stuck to me the most and that he brought up as well was he was very emotional that Obama was elected just because it was the president with an ethnic middle name. So then he hoped that hopefully he wouldn't necessarily be targeted or harassed when flying in airports. So that just goes to show the importance of just representation in positions of power, and just leaving people at ease, just seeing someone in power that could potentially, ease away the issues that they deal with in day-to-day life. My dad told me a lot more instances of prejudice he faced, but overall, I think his story always amazes me since at the age of 22 right now, I cannot go through like one fourth of what he went through in comparison. Like I was born and raised in Irvine, and thankfully I haven't really experienced discrimination for my ethnicity. Maybe, once or twice. I think like in high school, for example, when that movie, what's it called? I think Captain Phillips came out. I think a few people were just like, oh, like say the line, like I'm the captain now, because the actor is Somali and it was about Somali pirates. But in comparison, obviously, like the great difference between what my dad was going through, being targeted and wanted to be dead for it, was something that is something I could never experience. And I think what I took away from that most honestly is just having empathy for those around you. My dad is a very strong figure in my life, as well as like in his community. But obviously, like that doesn't necessarily show on the surface, and everyone clearly has more than meets the eyes. And I think it's interesting how I have similar identities to him, just being Somali and Muslim, yet my experiences are completely different than his. And just shows that even if you're in the same community, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the same response from the public. I think a lot of people have told me in the past that it's like, oh, you're like racially ambiguous, like we don't know what you are. So I feel like I haven't necessarily faced discrimination for any of those identities in my life. But obviously like heard some offhanded like stereotypes or like comments like passing. And like once they find out about, they're like, oh, I didn't mean it like that. In comparison to my dad throughout his like generations of like going through different countries and whatnot, people just blatantly just being racist and Islamophobic to him. But yeah, that is the crash course of my empathy interview with my dad.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Your father's an interesting person. He's had an amazing life, hasn't he? Yeah. So, and your life is totally different.
Yeah,
Totally
it's
different.
amazing, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. My daughter's best friend while she was in college was a young woman who was Somali, and they had to leave, and they were, she had a UN passport. She didn't have a Somali. Did your father have that kind of issue, or how did he deal with that?
Actually, my dad earlier was showing me like he has a briefcase of just like different like artifacts that he had like throughout his life. And he has like a passport from Djibouti that was basically given to him when like given asylum from the UN in Djibouti, and it's like all in French and just whatnot.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it would be very interesting. Would your father be willing to, show some of these and do a little more interview? That would be great. That would be interesting. So thank you. I'm sorry you didn't speak up more during the term. A very interesting interview, a good analysis. Thank you so much.